Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Half Pint Sessions. I'm fighting off a little bit of a cold, so no alcohol today, just some peppermint tea to hopefully soothe my throat and help me get through this interview in a way that doesn't sound like I'm a teenage boy with a breaking voice. But I'll move forward and say welcome to Haley Stewart, former guest of the show. She works for Word on Fire. Haley, welcome back to Pints with Jack.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, it's been a little while since you've been on, and for people who don't know who you are, would you mind just giving us a quick bio?
Sure. I live in Tallahassee, Florida. That's my hometown, but we recently relocated back home. So we'd been in Texas for a long time. I'm married to a distiller, so he makes whiskey for a living, which is a pretty fun job to have. We have
Mm,
four children, ages 5 through 14. And I'm the editor for Word on Fire's children's imprint in their publishing house. So I get to do everything from come up with ideas of books that should exist to finding illustrators to match with um, authors' proposals that come in. And it's just the most delightful work. And then I'm also an author. I write books for grown-ups as well as a fiction series for children called the Sister Seraphina Mysteries about mouse nuns who live underneath G.K. Chesterton's house and solve local crimes. And yeah, that about sums me up.
yeah, my wife has all of your mice books and absolutely loves them.
Oh
Um,
yeah, it's great to hear.
our kids aren't ready for them yet, but my wife certainly is. Okay, where to situate this? So, at the end of last season, patron supporters will know that we sent out an email saying that since we didn't manage to do a George MacDonald month that season, because we were having my latest child, Lucy, we decided that we were going to cut the MacDonald month, but to sort of replace it, we got Abigail Reno to record a custom recording of The Golden Key, and we sent it out to all of our patron supporters for free. And then very soon afterwards, I had confirmation of something I've honestly suspected for a long time, and it's that Bishop Robert Barron reads my email. Because almost the very next thing I see coming out of Word on Fire is a book relating to George MacDonald. So, um, firstly, Haley, can you confirm whether or not Bishop Barron does read my email? And if you just choose to deny it, I will accept that. You've got to stick with the party line. But would you mind telling us about this new book that's come out from Word on Fire?
Sure. Well, I can neither confirm nor deny
Mm.
which emails Bishop Barron is reading. Um, but yeah, so we have published George MacDonald's Golden Key, as well as The Light Princess and Little Daylight, two of his other fairy tales, in a beautiful a beautiful collection. We got new illustrations that are scattered throughout the book, and it just turned out beautiful. So, kind of the vision behind this project is this is the first in a series of books that are, we think of, these are classics that maybe aren't getting read very much by children today. So maybe books that have for some reason kind of fallen out of fashion or just been left behind, and although they're really valuable, wonderful texts, just you don't see a lot of children reading them today. So we kind of wanted to breathe new life into some of those stories that are so wonderful, and we want more people to be reading them. And I started with this collection because I was trying to think, what do we begin with if we want this to be a series of classic titles that really are books that baptize the imagination, and whether they're explicitly Christian or whether they're just stories that have these beautiful themes that the child is going to be formed by. Where do we begin? And so I agonized over this for months, months and months and months. I have a list a mile long of different titles I'd like in this series. But to begin, I decided on this one, partly because of how influential George MacDonald's fairy tales and his fiction, his writing, his theology was on so many other writers. And so I thought it would be great to start kids here because they're going to see this influence on C.S. Lewis. They're going to see this influence on Madeline L'Engle. They're going to see it on Neil Gaiman. And so I just was excited about starting it here because they're accessible, they're beautiful. The Light Princess is especially funny and fun. And I just thought they would be a great place to kind of start this project.
I do love it. Uh, he is really the grandfather of fantasy. A lot of people point to Tolkien just because The Lord of the Rings was just so massive, but Tolkien, like Lewis, like Langle, he was reaching to something else further back, and you can certainly see George MacDonald's influence upon him. And I didn't know of MacDonald until I started digging into Lewis. And it was when I was looking for a short Lewis book to tide me over for a week or two, and I discovered his anthology of George MacDonald's various sermons, extracts, and everything else that he'd written. And I blazed through it very quickly. And it's really funny when you discover an author who reminds you of another author, but yet still has their own distinct voice. There was something that I love about Lewis that I can hear in MacDonald's voice. And so I started to try and read Fantastes, which is the book which baptized C.S. Lewis's imagination. And I got to admit, although it was beautiful, I also kind of struggled with it. And
Strange
so
book. It's a
it is a
weird book.
very strange book. And then we had Dr. Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson on the show, and I asked her the question because we were doing a deep dive into Fantastes, and I asked her where would she recommend beginning, and she gave a few options, but one of them was with The Golden Key. And so I then restarted my appreciation of MacDonald with that, and that made all of the difference.
I love that advice. I think The Golden Key was also the first MacDonald that I had read. I'm trying to remember which order, whether I read Lilith and Fantastes and then some of the children's, or whether it was the other way around. But it's such a lovely story. And it's one that I think you can read over and over again. You know, you read it once and you're like, I like it. It's a little odd. I need to read it again. And it just kind of it simmers, and then you come
Yeah.
back to it and you see more and more of it makes sense. But I love this sense of longing in the story, this sense that the children know that there's something more that they're desiring, and they're kind of reaching for that, but not knowing, they don't know where it's going to lead them. They don't know where that longing will lead them. And I think you see that theme a lot in C.S. Lewis, that kind of, what does he call it, pangs of joy, when
Sehnsucht.
you have this experience where it's leading you to something else and you don't even know quite what that other thing is, but you know that it's out there and you're longing for that and wondering, where does that longing come from, which seems to be kind of one of his apologetics for the existence of something beyond the material world. Why do we long for another world if that doesn't exist? It really doesn't make any sense why we'd have that. And I think that's something that's really present in the Golden Key, in this beautiful fairy tale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. Now, are you planning on trying to do some more MacDonald titles next, or are you more likely to switch to a different author?
We're more likely to do a different author. I could see us coming back and doing maybe Princess and the Goblin, or something like
Hmm.
that in the future. I love that one. I went with the Golden Key because I think it's not read by children as often as the Princess and the Goblin.
Yeah.
So Princess and the Goblin is wonderful, but I just kind of wanted to bring this one to the forefront a little bit because I think it's not read as often. And then as I was reading through, I hadn't read The Light Princess before or Little Daylight. So I was kind of reading as many of his fairy tales as I could, trying to figure out what would make sense to go together in this collection. And so that was really delightful too. The Light Princess is so funny, almost silly at times. So it feels very different from The Golden Key, which is a little bit melancholy. It's a little bit, I don't know, you think of like Scotland on a foggy morning kind of thing, where the Light Princess is much more fun and accessible in some ways. And then Little Daylight was just such a beautiful fairy tale. And so we brought the three of them together, and it was such a delightful project to work on. And as I was kind of doing some more research on MacDonald, I didn't really know how influential he had been on Lewis and Tolkien, or
Mm,
sorry, and Chesterton. He did
yeah.
influence Tolkien, but Chesterton and Lewis are kind of his big fans.
Super fans.
So that was really interesting as well to just see how influential story is on their imaginations. It's not someone giving them a lecture about theology, but it was really his stories that started them off. Um, and then seeing where that led for both of these great evangelists.
Hmm. Now, you also released an article on the Word on Fire website as to why people should read MacDonald. Now, we've touched on a few of the reasons, such as he was very important to some very important people who are probably watching this video. But what are some other reasons that you think people should read MacDonald?
I think that the thing I haven't touched on so far in this conversation, MacDonald is very strange. His
Mm.
fiction is very strange in almost a biblical way. Um, you think of someone like Flannery O'Connor, the strangeness of her fiction is very Christian. And so I think in a very different way, MacDonald has these very strange stories that speak to the strangeness of God in this way. The way that he presents God is so interesting, so full of love. Like he presents such a loving God, but also there's this sense of a little bit of terror when you think about God, or that there's this I know I'm second guessing myself, but I think it's Flannery O'Connor where she's talking about that the terrible mercy of God is coming. And I think that is present in MacDonald, not in a way that I think would terrify children, but kind of like Aslan the lion is scary as well as loving. That I think that's a thread all through MacDonald's fiction.
He's good, but he's not safe.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Well, this has been great. So, where should people go if they want to pick up a copy?
Well, currently we are sold out, which is a good problem, but we're getting a second printing in soon. So you can go to Word on Fire's online bookshop is the best place to find it. When we have books in stock, it'll also be available at Amazon.com, so you can find it there as well. But hopefully our new shipment will be coming very soon.
And do you have any sense as to what's going to be coming next, or any personal projects you want to talk about before we sign off?
Well, there's a lot of ones I'm considering E. Nesbit.
Mm, Samyad for Children
Considering
in It. Absolutely love it. My wife and I were just talking about books that we're going to buy while my mother is visiting for the holidays. And it's like, I need her to read this to my children.
Yes, I love E. Nesbit. There's so many good ones. I have a list a mile long that I just bring out once a week and agonize over what's the priority. Oh, but then what if we did this one? But I think we may go with Grimm's fairy tales next,
Mm.
and really go back to the originals, not the Disney-fied versions, because I think that there's something for children do have fears about things like death, things like danger, that is present in a child's imagination. And I think often we try to present stories that are very safe and kind of a little too precious, perhaps, because we don't want to upset children because we love children. But I think that can end up preventing a child from having a safe place, a story to wrestle with some of those things they're afraid of and things that they're trying to process, like their mortality. And I think that there's something very healthy for a child to read things like Grimm's fairy tales, which are truthfully a little bit more gory or uncomfortable than a lot of the stories we often give children. But I think there is a longing that children have to wrestle with those things. And I think that we do a disservice to them if we kind of dismiss their fears instead of offering them a safe place to wrestle with with those fears. So that's the main reason that I'm really interested in doing an edition, a collection. There are so many of Grimm's fairy tales. I've been reading through them, and I don't want to give them all because there's just so too many. I think it would be overwhelming. But what I'm doing right now is kind of going through and reading through and thinking, okay, which are perhaps the 30 or 40 that we think are most important for a child to read in the forming of their imagination, and do a collection there. So that's kind of next on my list. We'll see if something takes priority, but I think that's the direction we're going to go in.
That makes me really happy because my son has a blue book of fairy tales, which he makes me read him every night, and I am sick to death of them all. But also, as you mentioned, the sort of Disneyfication. It's actually not a Disney book, but oof, you can see its influence. So I do like the idea of going back to Grimm's, and Chesterton and Lewis repeatedly expressed that point that you were making about the place of danger and sadness in stories for children to encounter them in a safe space. Lewis says that since it's so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage.
Yes, I love that. And I've been reading a lot from Catherine Patterson, who she wrote The Bridge to Terabithia.
Oh, okay.
So she's
I only saw the movie.
Yeah, prolific children's book writer. But what has caught me is her collection of talks that she's given on children's literature and what it should be. And it's a splendid collection called The Invisible Child. But one of the things she talks about is that often people will come to her about her book, The Bridge to Terabithia, which is about a child who dies. And they'll say, oh, I have a child in my life who had someone close to them die, and so then I gave them your book. And she says, well, it's a little too late. I wish they'd read it before this happened, because death is going to touch everyone's life. And so it's healthy to present a place where the child can kind of, in a safe place, practice what that's going to feel like. What would that be like, and let that form their imagination in this safe environment. And I thought that was so interesting. I think that sometimes when we prevent children from encountering these ideas, we're actually making them more anxious. We're actually making them more afraid
Unprepared.
because they haven't been given the opportunity to process and wrestle with the reality of those things, that they know this is real. They know that death is out there. And so to say, oh, don't worry about that. Well, they will worry about it. So how can we offer them stories that kind of point to this greater story that, yes, death is a part of life, danger, loss, suffering, and yet what is going to happen at the end? What is the last chapter going to be? And to provide them with a worldview that says, well, the last chapter is hope. The last chapter is resurrection. That I think is the right way to offer them a response to their fears.
Wonderful. Well, until you get that book out, I'm going to keep reading the blue book and hating my life every time I do it. But I always insist on afterwards that we read a golden book that I found at a secondhand store. It's called Grover's Guide to Manners. So we learn how to say please and thank you. So I feel like the evening isn't entirely wasted if we get to go through that once more.
Sure.
Wonderful. Haley Stewart, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
You too. And please join us again next time when we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.